Hello everyone and welcome to Drydock episode 84. I'm going to change things around a little bit. I'm going to see how people react to me moving the channel admin to the end, so we can launch straight into question time. So let's get on straight with the questions taken this week from the videos on the Thunderchild, Chapter 17 reading of War of the Worlds, and the 40 Thieves of the Royal Navy. Dat Good asks, in terms of their technology, who was superior, the Imperial Japanese Navy or the Kriegsmarine? Well, it's a question that doesn't have any one definitive answer because you can point to areas in both navies where they had a decided advantage over the other. So, for example, if you're looking at the Imperial Japanese Navy, they, towards the end of the war, probably had some of, if not the best, optical fire control systems on the planet. But at the same time, this was because they were so very severely behind in terms of radar development, and whilst the Germans had good optical fire control systems, by the time that Japan was rolling out these really good ones towards the mid to end of the war, the Germans were far and away ahead of the Japanese in terms of radar, especially on things like ships. Then you can look at things like, say, carrier aircraft and aircraft carriers, in which case Japan wins handily by dint of actually having them, whereas obviously the Germans didn't quite manage that. Then you can look at torpedoes, and torpedoes gets a very interesting little bit of discussion because the Japanese have obviously the Type 93 Long Lance, the Type 95 submarine miniature version, which are significantly superior in terms of range, speed, and in the Type 93's case, firepower, as compared to most of the German torpedoes. But then at the same time, the Germans would later on develop the acoustic homing torpedoes. So technology-wise, for torpedoes, it largely depends on what particular aspect of torpedo technology you're looking at. And you can go on like that. I mean, German dual-purpose guns weren't fantastic to start with, but the end product was better than most Japanese dual-purpose weapons, with the exception perhaps of the 100mm. But then the Japanese had more dual-purpose sort of medium-caliber weaponry, sort of 5-inch guns and stuff like that, for a lot longer than the Germans did on things like the Fubukis, albeit, as we've covered in the Fubuki video, they didn't necessarily work very well, but they did something. In terms of light anti-aircraft, well, shockingly enough, the Germans are going to take the cake and walk away with that particular one, because, well, the flak Vierling, 37mm, etc., well, it doesn't take very much to be better than the Japanese 25mm, but the German light AA was handily superior to that. Submarines, again, the German submarines had more success, so you could argue that they have the superior submarine technology, albeit that a lot of that is due to target availability and tactics. The Japanese, on the other hand, had submarines that were significantly larger, and in other cases significantly faster than the Germans, so perhaps in terms of pure submarine tech, hull design, etc., the Japanese are ahead, but then the Germans ended up with things like the Schnorkel and the Electra boats later on, albeit obviously they did kind of steal the Schnorkel off the Dutch, so don't know whether that quite counts as Kriegsmarine technology exactly. And even when you look at various components of larger systems, so you look at something like, say, the shells in naval guns, German shells on a similar caliber basis tended to have significantly better penetration, but that was because the Japanese, at least in part, because they had configured a lot of their shells for diving attacks, which the German shells weren't so capable of doing. And the Japanese shells at least had the decency to explode most of the time, whereas the German shells had a fairly significant problem with duds. And then when you look in something like, say, anti-submarine warfare technology, the Germans were significantly ahead of the Japanese. So hopefully from those examples you can determine that, yeah, when it comes to comparing those two navies, or indeed almost any two navies in World War II, whilst you might be able in certain circumstances to point to a majority of technology being superior in one navy versus the other, in most cases, and especially in this case, there are different areas where the navies have superiority over each other, and so you can't definitively say that one is flat out technologically superior to the other, because it's going to come down largely to what exactly are you trying to do. For example, to summarize, if you are trying to launch a long-range submarine attack with relatively little chance of being detected, then you probably, towards the end of the war, want to go with a German electroboat firing acoustic homing torpedoes, because whatever the Japanese still have left at that point is decidedly inferior to that. Conversely, if you want to, I don't know, sink a large portion of the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, you're going to have to go with a Kido Butai on that one, because much as it might have been a relatively sophisticated float plane, a handful of Arado 196s are probably not going to do all that much. West Virginia Fisherman asks, could the British or French have purpose-built landing craft, or at least modified cargo and troop ships for the Gallipoli Landings, instead of using rowboats to offload troops? If so, what would such things look like with World War I technology, and would it have made an appreciable difference to the outcome of the campaign? Well, allow me to introduce you to the SS River Clyde. This was a former collier that was taken into Royal Navy service during World War I and was adapted for the Gallipoli Landings. You can see it here, actually on one of the Gallipoli beaches. In order to convert her into possibly the bluntest form of amphibious assault transport I've yet seen, they literally took the collier, converted the cargo holds to hold troops, welded a bunch of spare boilerplate onto the bow, along with some sandbag emplacements to make her bulletproof, put in a quite fearsome machine gun nest of almost a dozen machine guns to provide fire support, and then cut some holes in the side for the troops to exit out of, along with some bridges alongside the hull. The ship was then basically sailed straight at the beach, spitting machine gun rounds all the way, rammed into the beach, and then everybody theoretically would get out of the sides, down the bridges, and then using some further pontoon bridges constructed out of ship's boats onto the beach. So yes, very early, very blunt, very somewhat hodgepodge put together amphibious assault ship, with emphasis on the assault part. So yes, they could and did, albeit this was pretty much a one-off. Unfortunately, the assault didn't quite work out as well as planned, because whilst almost a dozen machine guns is a fair amount of firepower to be spitting at enemy infantry, the Turkish defences were considerably larger than that, and whilst the River Clyde's impromptu forward armour did protect the troops inside to a certain degree, the bridges, for the sheer number of men that she had, made rather obvious targets for Turkish defensive fire, and so the landing that she took part in was not exactly successful on the day that she launched the assault. Now, in terms of landing craft, something along the lines of what you see being used at D-Day is theoretically possible. There's nothing to prevent them building what's effectively a small steel barge with a drop ramp at the front. The single biggest restriction would be the fact that internal combustion engines were very much in their infancy at this point. You can just sort of look at the relatively low power to weight ratio of early tanks and even aircraft to see that. And so finding an engine that is compact enough to fit into something the size of a small troop landing craft, but also provides enough power to allow it to do anything much more than meander pointlessly in the current, would be somewhat difficult. Most of the powered launches and such like that existed at this time, which would have been of a similar size and had relatively similar performance capabilities, were generally steam launches. And if there's one thing you probably don't want to take up to a beach, it's a high-pressure steam engine system. you've got enough dangers for your troops without having a risk of a boiler explosion right behind them when all the machine guns and light artillery are firing at them from the front. So that would have been a bit more questionable. Perhaps some of the early destroyers could have been used. There would have been a little bit of an expensive way to get rid of them, but at the end of the day, they weren't really much use to anyone else. Sort of the stuff from the 1880s and early 1890s. Although, again, they're at risk of some rather nasty damage, but they would have come with a bit of firepower to help out as well. So, yeah, the concepts in general were there. There was a little bit of technological limitation, but if you were going to go back with a bit of foreknowledge, then perhaps more vessels like the River Clyde, but perhaps with maybe a couple of shielded deck guns, maybe 3-4 inch guns or something like that to help with the heavier beach defences, and a few more sally ports, maybe something in terms of protection for the men. And yeah, maybe reuse very old early model destroyers and gunboats and such as expendable troop transports. But that would have required a lot more planning and a lot more foreknowledge about just how much the Turks had reinforced their beach defences as opposed to what the Allies historically had. In terms of the effect, well, as I said, the Turks had, with the help of the Germans, upgraded their beach defences quite considerably, so it's impossible to say exactly how improving the landing craft would have benefited everybody if the landings had taken place at the same time and place. But, well, it certainly would have lowered casualties on the run-in and probably during the initial assault, as obviously heavier covering fire, etc. But whether that would have then allowed them to breach the defences and the Turkish lines, I don't know, without going into a very detailed examination of the land side of the Gallipoli campaign. Josh Thomas Moore asks, what were the pros and cons of the Torpedo ram ships? So at the time they were built, the Torpedo ram ship inhabited a niche that seemed to be absolutely perfect. It had appeared that thanks to incidents like the Battle of Lissa, the ramming was probably more effective at sinking enemy ships than gunfire. There were also a number of advances in propulsion technology that would allow a ship to move relatively quickly and close the range. Gun range itself was still relatively close in, and so there was a relatively short distance to cover. Plus, gun accuracy and rate of fire was questionable at best, so the idea of something with a relatively small forward profile that was moving very quickly being relatively difficult to hit was actually fairly sound. Now, combine all of that, and you might think, well, a ram ship would be an ideal thing to do. But to get the speed, you needed a long, narrow hull, and as Josh Thomas Moore points out in his question, long, narrow hulls are not particularly manoeuvrable. And if there's one thing a ship would desperately try and avoid, it would be to be getting rammed. And also, if you made your small, low, fast ram ship, there is also every possibility it might come up against something seriously large, at which point it would just crumple against the side, like a slightly more tinny fly on a windshield. So you didn't necessarily want to try and ram absolutely everything in sight, unless you were building a battleship-scale ram vessel, which nobody actually did. And so the torpedo ram vessel seemed to be the eminently sensible solution, because if you were running in and you suddenly found your target was a lot bigger and nastier than you thought it might be, or indeed that you were running in and you found that your target was almost certainly going to evade you and your agility wasn't sufficient to actually catch them, or possibly even they score a lucky hit and cripple your engines or something, you can then launch torpedoes, which will effectively do the same job only with more boom, and so you can still sink the target. And also, if you're charging into a battle line, you might be able to pick a target to ram, but you can then launch one or more torpedoes at nearby targets in the line of battle, thus ensuring that your attack run has a chance, at least, of destroying or disabling multiple enemy ships. Torpedoes at this particular point, when the first torpedo rams were under construction, were recognised as powerful but somewhat slow and short-ranged weapons. The growth of torpedo range to the point where it matched effective gun range for the period was a few years down the line. So those were the pros. The cons were effectively the technological niche that allowed for a torpedo ram to be a sensible idea was basically gone by the time the first torpedo rams were actually in service. This was the rate of technological advancement in the late 19th century. So the single biggest thing was the invention of the quick-firing gun. Obviously you had automatic weapons, sort of the equivalent of 20, 40mm cannons, but on anything decent ship size, A, protection against them is relatively easy, and B, well, the actual impact of any kind of projectile is going to be relatively minimal. But by the time ships like Polyphemus and Katydin were in service, quick-firing guns had managed to escalate up to 3, 4, 5, even 6-inch weapons, and thus a maneuverable quick-firing gun of this kind of caliber would be able to put enough damage into a torpedo ram, which was necessarily relatively light and, relatively speaking, unprotected, in order to stop it cold. Speed and agility of ships was also increasing, which would mean that a ship that had been built at the time of, say, Polyphemus would be outpaced flat out by its targets in many cases within 5 to 10 years, which made the whole ramming part rather difficult. And at the end of the day, you were putting funds into a ship that was designed to do one very specific thing, which was to ram and sink enemy warships, which is all fine and good, but a small cruiser, whilst it might not be quite the specialist in ramming, could still launch torpedoes. It had more gun firepower, so it could engage enemy ships in a gun duel. It was also therefore more able to defend itself against attempts by, say, other ram ships or destroyers to attack it, and it could obviously then be used to support colonial operations, merchant escort or merchant raiding, depending on whose navy you belong to, and a whole variety of other uses, including things like scouting, none of which a torpedo ram could do very effectively, if at all. So you're effectively making a very, very specialist weapon, which had about one use that it was marginally good at, and that use was outpaced very quickly by rapidly advancing technology. So those were the cons of the torpedo ram ship, and ramming as a whole obviously generally went out of fashion relatively quickly, the torpedo aspect being taken up mostly by destroyers and partially by cruisers. And a number of people asked this question, but I'm going to pick Sternefunken's particular question, which is, how do you reckon the fate of the Channel Squadron went? Is the mass of smoke which rose slantingly and barred the face of the sun a gas attack, the considerable smoke of an entire squadron steaming fast and firing their guns in a defiant but pointless raid, or the smoke of the Majestics and Royal Sovereigns burning up? This is obviously from the end of the Thunderchild chapter. So at the time that War of the Worlds is set, you're looking at a Channel Squadron or Channel Fleet strength of around half a dozen battleships and half a dozen cruisers, most of which seem to be present. I mean, 3 of them are present going past the steamer, and it seems that they join up with others later on. Now, quite how that battle goes, obviously, it's never quite made clear to us, but there's a certain amount of interpretation that we can do. Firstly, we need to look at what we know versus what we don't know. So what we do know for the Martians is that the heat ray is capable of piercing straight through into the heart of an ironclad. So it would appear that the protection afforded by the Royal Navy ship's armour is relatively minimal. We also know that they're capable of manoeuvring at sea, wading out into the sea, into the channel waters, but we also know that they're not agile enough to avoid being rammed. We also know that, at least as far as the book is concerned, the Martians don't appear to have any kind of particularly good night vision or any kind of sensor systems, etc. So they will be as impaired by the darkness in which the confrontation takes place just as much as the Royal Navy will be. And that's pretty much all we know for the Martians. What we don't know about them is how many of the tripods are actually out there in that particular confrontation. We do know that the black smoke doesn't have too much effect on mobile shipping because the ship just sails out of it before it can take on much impact. And that's basically all we know for the Martians. For the Royal Navy, we know, obviously, the approximate strength of the ships involved. We also know from earlier in the book that guns can destroy the tripods, and, well, a gun that's man-portable and relatively obsolete from a British Army battery can destroy a tripod. So it's fairly safe to say that the quick-firing secondary, tertiary batteries, and not to mention the main battery of a large British cruiser or battleship would almost certainly tear through a tripod like it wasn't even there. And we also know that the Martians are aware, theoretically after the fall of the Thunderchild, that these ships are a threat. Now the scenario, as we said, is it's in the evening, it's at night, so it's dark. The account specifically mentions murk and haze, so that's going to cut visibility down even further. So what you're probably going to have is one of the key Martian advantages following the Thunderchild engagement, which is they know it's a threat, so they can theoretically heat ray anything that comes close, is actually significantly removed because the visibility is cut down to a point where the engagement's probably occurring at a range where the Royal Navy ships can actually open fire and possibly expect to score hits, especially with their secondary batteries, around about the same time that the Martians can engage with their heat ray. It also seems, from the description of the battle with the Thunderchild, that the heat ray does have some kind of recharge time. So it's not kind of like a rapid-fire laser weapon or anything. They managed to get a couple of shots off into the Thunderchild, but that seems to take a few minutes to do. So all in all, I think it's going to come down to just exactly how many tripods there were out there. The rising mass of smoke could be explained by any number of things. Certainly the Royal Navy, the Channel Squadron, is not coming out of this without casualties. But they do have a relatively decent fighting chance, in as much as between the sheer number of guns that they have and the fact that they can engage pretty much upon sight and start trying to knock down tripods, plus, of course, they can ram them, means they have a good chance of destroying tripods. However, the heat ray is going to be a 1 or 2 shot kill weapon, and the Martians are going to be a lot more willing to use it. So between the funnel smoke, the gun smoke, the general murk, etc., quite what that massive black cloud entails is difficult to tell. As I said, the Channel Squadron will be taking casualties. They're not going to come out of this intact. But if it was, say, a half dozen tripods and they suddenly run into the entire Channel Squadron or Channel Fleet going line abreast at point blank range through the murk, I'd say there's a reasonable chance the Channel Fleet comes out of that on top. Well, in as much as there be some ships that are walking away from that engagement. Whereas if it's perhaps even numbers or numbers weighted in favour of the Martian tripods or something close to that, then the tripods will almost certainly come off the winner, again, albeit with casualties. So we'd need to know a little bit more information about that particular engagement. It could go either way, but certainly there are going to be casualties on both sides, and it's not going to be pretty. And I have a feeling that H.G. Wells probably deliberately left it ambiguous like that by engineering the situation as he described, because if that battle had taken place a few hours earlier in the middle of broad daylight, after the Thunderchild had been sunk, it would have been basically a one-sided curb stomp in favour of the Martians. Night Heron Production asks a couple of questions, specifically about whether or not the Mosquito could, or maybe was used as a carrier aircraft, and how good it would have been, and separately, if there's any truth to accounts of the Mosquito being used against communist Chinese forces by the opposing side in the late 1940s. So in 1944 there was a test of a seaborne Mosquito. This is an example of the type, the Sea Mosquito TR-33, as you can see equipped with radar and its 4 20mm cannons and a torpedo. So yes, big torpedo bomber Mosquito. Test took place aboard HMS Indefatigable, and it should come as no surprise to any aviation enthusiast that Eric Winkle Brown was the person who was landing it, because of course he did. So it was certainly possible to use a Mosquito from a carrier in World War II. Obviously this particular version was adapted for full-on carrier service, but that said, there's nothing specifically stopping you from using a more general-purpose Mosquito, at least in flight operations off a carrier flight deck, although getting back might be somewhat interesting. But perhaps not quite Doolittle style, but you could almost certainly have flown Mosquitoes off of carrier flight decks as long as they had a land base to head back to. Now, obviously, the Mosquito is fast and fairly well armed. I mean, the TR-33 here was designed to carry its 4 20mm cannons, plus bombs, plus rockets, plus torpedoes, so it could certainly lay down a lot of hurt, but with its sheer size, you probably would need to use a relatively large carrier for it. Something like the Malta class would have been a good example, but these tests did reveal, because of the they revealed that you could use a twin-engine aircraft of about this size, and so although the Sea Mosquito didn't see that much widespread service, it laid the foundation for its successor, the de Havilland Sea Hornet, which did serve aboard Royal Navy ships in both fighter and strike roles for a number of years post-war. Now, as far as Mosquitoes being used by the nationalist Chinese against the communist Chinese, they definitely were. Here's one. They're mostly Canadian surpluses that were offloaded to the nationalist Chinese back when it looked like the nationalist Chinese might actually have a fighting chance. Now, in terms of the specific attacks on a Japanese communist invasion fleet, the interview comes from a relatively credible source, an ex-Mosquito pilot of fairly high repute, but as far as the specific veracity of the nationalist Chinese engaging an invasion fleet with specific kills scored on specific days, that bit was probably beyond my initial expertise to verify details for, since whilst I know where to find an awful lot of information about naval history, and I could probably find out if it had been an RAF operation, since a lot of the historical archives that the UK keeps share Army, Navy and RAF records, when it comes to something that's possibly under the guidance of the Canadians and mostly done by the nationalist Chinese, and it's aircraft related, I'm probably not the best person to ask. On the other hand, if you drop that question to military aviation history, aka Bismarck, if he manages to have a look at it, he's probably got a much better chance of finding you specific answers than I do. Kendra Malm asks, why is there a quarterdeck but no halfdeck or thirddeck or eightdeck, and why is there a forecastle but no sterncastle, or potentially sterncastle? Well, as regards the forecastle and the somewhat apparently missing sterncastle, sterncastle sounds a bit too much like I'm from up north. The original ships that had this designation quite literally did have forecastles and aftercastles, or sterncastles. And as you can see here on this picture of a model of a medieval cog, they were quite literally small wooden castles. This was back in the era, as you can see, no cannons particularly in evidence, when warships took the form quite often of merchant ships that would have these structures built fore and aft, and then they'd go and effectively have a small land battle, except at sea. And when you're having a land battle, having a fortification is a good idea, and so these castles would be areas where you could launch various projectiles, whether they be arrows or fire pots or whatever from, and you could also protect and dominate the decks of your own ship. And the forecastle, eventually becoming shortened to forecastle, remained the designation for the raised forward part of the ship, which would remain part of ship construction pretty much up until the transition to iron shipping, by which point the name was well and truly stuck. However, the stern or after castle was subsumed into other structures, including the quarterdeck, as well as the poop deck, etc. And so that particular bit of phraseology began to fall out of fashion and out of use a lot quicker than forecastle did. Now, in terms of why there's a quarterdeck, this basically actually derives from the demise of the stern or after castle, and the structure sort of being generally cut down, but still somewhat useful because it helped to enclose things like officers' cabins, the steering positions, as well as giving a decent vantage point, etc., and occasionally setting up shrines for some reason. But as it was raised above the main deck of the ship, it would obviously run from the stern forwards, and generally speaking, as you can probably, if you remember from that picture of the cog, its extent would be approximately a quarter of the ship's length, hence quarter deck. It's a quarter length deck. It just so happened that that's how it kind of worked out and roughly how it stayed. So again, it became ingrained and gradually came to refer to the upper part of the stern of any given ship, even well after both the specific length of the quarterdeck might no longer be a quarter of the length of the whole ship, or indeed it might not even be a raised section of the ship. For example, on something like HMS Hood, the quarterdeck was actually lower than the main deck, and on a lot of modern ships where you have helicopter landing pads and such, the quarterdeck may well be somewhat below the level of the main deck in some cases. But it's still there, and it's still called that. As for halfdeck, thirddeck, eightdeck, basically, they didn't really build other decks of those kind of proportions in large enough numbers that the nomenclature stuck around. Eric Heath asks, you don't build a house out of green wood, so why on earth would you build a ship with green wood, unless I've missed something? So green wood-built ships did occur in wartime, but it was for very specific reasons. Wood, obviously, for a warship should be seasoned, which involves in part drying it out, amongst other things. But good seasoned wood will cost a fair bit. Now, that's for a number of reasons. One, you need the storage spaces in which to store the wood to season it out, and that can be a process of years. Secondly, as wood dries out, you do get cracking and such like, so there'll be a certain percentage of loss from the timbers that you've cut. And then, so with less wood and all the storage costs involved, it costs a lot more, and of course people know that it's the best building material for a wooden ship, and so they're going to charge an additional premium for that because they can. Now, with green wood, the primary reason you don't build with green wood is because, well, it's still moist, it's still in the process of drying out, which means that if you build a ship out of it, the bits that are underwater are going to dry out understandably at a somewhat different rate to the bits above water, which is going to lead to warping and cracking and leaks, and then everybody sinks and drowns, which is not good. And also, being quite moist, it means the interior is moist and the ship starts to rot out very quickly. On top of that, depending on the specific kind of wood, some green wood can be substantially weaker than its seasoned form. So you might think, okay, well, based on all that, why would you do that? Well, very simply, stocks of seasoned wood are things that are, as we said, are the process of years to make. And if you're in the middle of a war and you're churning out ships as fast as humanly possible, your supplies of seasoned wood might run out or run low. And if they've run out completely, you've got no choice. If they've run low, you have to make priority decisions as to which particular ships you're going to try and build out of your remaining stocks of seasoned wood. Now, obviously, in the middle of a war, when you're losing ships and you need more ships, you can't just stop building ships, and that means you're forced, by circumstance, to use the green wood, because it's better to have a ship that might only last a few years than not have one, considering the war is hopefully only going to last a few years. So what you would then try and do is you would build ships that you don't anticipate keeping for very long out of green wood just to get them in the water. So, for example, a number of ships that the Royal Navy built were constructed either from green wood or softwood, or in some cases both, specifically to counter the American super frigates, because the Royal Navy needed to throw something big and nasty together in frigate form to fight the super frigates, but it didn't anticipate that particular war lasting much longer, so the fact that the ships would fall apart in a few years didn't matter so much, because they could still recover the fixtures, fittings, and guns, and that would then allow them to hold off the American frigates for now, and then look into building a more considered design later on. And similarly on the war for the Great Lakes, well, seasoned wood was in very short supply because the Great Lakes had not previously been particular hotbeds of massive naval construction, and so there just weren't the stocks, generally speaking, for massive construction of naval warships. And shipping them in was very expensive, so it was, again, easier and fast and cheaper to build out of greenwood, on the assumption the ship would either be lost fairly quickly or else would end up being taken apart at the end of the war. Gordon Adler asks, Dear Drac, I was recently reminded there is a difference between a 3-gun turret and a triple-gun turret, with the former designating guns which can be independently operated. I can't honestly remember now if you use the terms interchangeably or not, but since it's my understanding that you like your details to be quite correct, probably not. Nevertheless, maybe you'd like to comment. So I did cover this previously in a much older Drydock, but since there's a lot of new viewers since then, it probably bears a few minutes to quickly repeat. So as Gordon Adler rightly points out, there is a difference between a triple and a 3-gun turret, or a twin and 2-gun, or a quad and 4-gun. And that is that when you talk of a twin or dual, triple or quad turret, what you're technically saying is that the gun turret possesses 2, 3, or 4 guns, but that they are also in what's called common cradle, i.e. they all elevate at the same time, they all depress at the same time, they're all locked together. And a 2-gun, 3-gun, or 4-gun turret indicates that the guns are in their own separate cradles so that they can elevate and move, etc. independently. Now, that's actually fairly important because a multi-gun turret, like a 3-gun turret, has a lot more versatility and a lot more durability against battle damage, because if you knock out one of the guns and jam it, the other 2 can operate just fine. And obviously you can, by elevating them separately, that allows you to, in the initial engagement, form a better ladder of shots, and also allows for more mundane things that might take a gun out of action, such as jams, to not adversely affect the performance of the rest of your guns. It also makes it easier to install things like delay coil fire mechanisms and such. To be honest, the only real major advantage of a common cradle gun is that the overall installation is simpler and therefore lighter. And because it's simpler and lighter, it's also what a number of earlier turrets tended to use. Now, when I use the terms, this is one of the areas where I tend to use a common term for general clarity as opposed to any more specific technical term, which might be more technically correct, but probably lead to a bit more confusion. I will use twin or dual, triple and quad to describe the turrets, because in the times when I'm using that, which is usually in 5-minute guides, the purpose of the term is to convey the information of how many guns that particular ship had in that particular kind of turret. So with an Iowa, as pictured here, I would say it has 3 triple turrets, which is a nice shorthand way everyone understands, yes, it has 3 turrets and each turret has 3 guns in it. Whereas 3-gun turrets, the alliteration doesn't quite roll off properly, but also it's slightly longer. I mean, yeah, okay, it's not too much longer, but when you're trying to cram everything into 5 minutes, more or less, every second and every syllable counts. And also by switching constantly back and forth between triple and 3-gun, or twin, dual and 2-gun, etc., probably would generate a certain amount of confusion when, as I say, the purpose of the particular phrase is not to convey intricate working details of the particular turret, but simply to indicate how many guns there are per turret. But I am aware of the difference, and so if I am looking into something in a very specific detail, like some of the extended looks on the Iowas, then I will at that point use the technically correct terminology, whether that be triple or 3-gun, quad or 4-gun, etc. So hopefully that clears it up. But as I say, the 5-minute guides are there to give a brief pricey rundown and to allow people to then look into subjects and ships that interest them further. So that's why I use twin, triple, quad, etc. in more general terms. Admiral Tiberius asks a 2-part question. 1. If the French had managed to build the Normandy and Lyon class battleships, would they have been obsolete on launch, or would they have been competitive with other ships of the period? And secondly, why doesn't Helmuth Heye get more recognition for his conduct after the battle with Glowworm? Or was what he did pretty standard during the war? So, with the Normandies and Lyons, it's a bit of a difficult one. The Normandies, I don't think would have been obsolete. They would have been maybe sort of middle of the road-ish for the time. You have to look at the time period that they're laid down in. What are their immediate sort of competitor ships? You've got in Britain, their laying down kind of overlaps with the last of the Iron Dukes and the first of the Queen Elizabeths. In Germany, it overlaps with the last of the Königs and the first of the Bayerns. In America, it's a little bit harder because you've got the New Yorks and then the Nevadas, but the New Yorks significantly predate them and the Nevadas slightly post-date them. There's a bit of a gap there. So in a lot of cases, as you can probably tell from that listing, you're looking at the kind of the turning point of battleship construction. In Europe, you're going over to the 15-inch gun super dreadnought, and with the Nevadas, you're seeing the rise of the standard battleship. Now, speed-wise, the Normandies are a little bit faster than some of the American ships, about average for everybody else, except for the Queen Elizabeths, which are their own little special case. Armour-wise, they're a little bit towards the lower end, but not massively so. And speed, so the only thing that's really left in the speed, protection, firepower is the firepower part. Now, the French gun that's being used on the Normandy, and indeed the Lyon class, the 340mm or 13.4-inch gun, well, it's near as much as make no difference, almost exactly the same as the 13.5 inches on the Iron Dukes. It's also only slightly smaller, obviously, than the US 14-inch guns. It's larger than the 12-inch guns on the König, and it is, of course, fairly small compared to the 15-inch guns aboard Bayern and Queen Elizabeth. So again, it's kind of a middle-of-the-road gun for the period. It's not an awful gun. It's not massively groundbreaking, but it's a decent serviceable naval gun. The one big disadvantage that the Normandies would have had compared to other ships of the time is range. In keeping with a lot of French dreadnought design at that period, their actual maximum gun range is actually pretty awful, at about 17,000 yards. So to give you some idea of what that means, that's basically the Battle of Jutland engagements open at around this kind of range when people are actually a lot closer than they think they are. So even the 11 and 12-inch guns on the German ships can outrange this heavier French gun. Now, that's not entirely the fault of the gun. That is in part because the French were a little bit behind the curve in terms of expected engagement ranges and thought the battle ranges would be a lot closer, and so the guns couldn't elevate as far. They could fix that in theory, but certainly out of the starting block, that would be the single biggest disadvantage for the Normandies, because number of guns, well, you got 12 guns, so that's more than anything else that's present at the time, because everyone else is either 8 or 10 guns, but they're these sort of slightly shorter range weapons. So if they can get the elevation adjusted so that they can get a bit more range out of it, yeah, I'd say decent battleships for that period. Now, the Lyon class, that is another story, because they are very much adapted from the Normandy class. Speed doesn't increase. Their mixed propulsion of steam turbines and triple expansions, as planned, might have gone to all turbines, but the fact they were even considering it by the mid 1910s is a significant step back. Armour protection hasn't increased at all, and that is now quite deficient, because when you compare the sort of the mid-range standards that are being built at this point, with the 12-14-inch gun standards, you've obviously got the Bayerns and completing, and Saxon and Württemberg are probably the closest comparisons. The Revenges are around at this point, but a lot of, apart from America, Britain and Germany suffer from the fact that obviously they've paused or slowed down most capital ship construction, so there's no direct sort of comparator, but the very quickly looking at it, apart from the American standards, everything else that's being built at the time that the Lions would have been built is faster. Everything is significantly better protected. And so really the only thing that the Lions have going for them are the ridiculous numbers of guns with the 4 quad turrets. But again, they're now still on the 13.4-inch weapons. So the US is using updated models of 14-inch gun, and everyone else is using 15-inch guns. And if the war hadn't broken out, you probably would have seen even bigger and nastier designs coming along to compete. So yeah, with all of that taken into account, I don't think the Lions would have been competitive with their contemporaries, even in the historical timeline, had they been completed, because we're talking about ships being laid down in 1915 and 1916. They wouldn't have been launched and entering service until at least probably 1918, assuming that either the French pressed on with construction or the war didn't happen. And when you look at, okay, what's happening by the time they're entering service in 1918, the Germans unfortunately haven't done all that much in the latter part of the war, but the British have pulled out the hood. The Americans are making strong strides towards the Colorado, even if they haven't quite got there yet. Something of the Leon spec basically just has the shotgun approach going for it, and that's really about it. So Normandy's would have been good. I think the Leons not so much. Although, given that they'd have a year or two further to think about it, and possibly even a little bit of time during construction, if they'd chosen to go with a larger weapon, say a 15-inch gun, and replaced the 4 quads with 3 triples, the armor's still not fantastic, the speed's still not fantastic, but the armament certainly would have been better. Yeah, there's not really much that you can say to put the Leons in a decent bracket at the time of their proposed construction, unfortunately. So, as regards Helmuth Heye, I think he gets a decent amount of recognition. Unfortunately, his name is not quite as familiar as some other German captains and admirals' names. But broadly speaking, I think amongst those who know of the action between Hipper and Glowworm, most people, as part of that, will immediately have some words of praise for him, even if they just know him as the captain of the Hipper. He probably deserves a little bit more recognition than that, because, as I've said in previous videos, although his action of rescuing survivors was pretty much on a par with the standard behaviour of most naval officers during the war, some of his actions, including the rapidity of changeover from combat to rescue, and also the efforts that he went to inform the British and Captain Roper's family of what he had accomplished, that was above and beyond the call of duty, I think, because there have been obviously numerous actions, and during those actions, various captains either didn't note that much about the conduct of the enemy captain, or if they did, it was mentioned in their official reports or their dispatches or something like that. But there weren't that many who went out of their way to either publicly applaud the actions of their opposite number or indeed to try and convey that information back to any surviving family they might have had back in the opposing country in the middle of a war. So that part, I think, was unusual and probably something for which he does need a little bit more recognition than some other captains and admirals of the Kriegsmarine. Daryl Smith asks, when taking into account all the qualities, explosive used, range, accuracy, armor penetration, etc., etc., was the difference between the 18-inch Japanese gun and its accompanying AP shell and the 16-inch American gun and shell really much more than marginal? So although much is made of the whole sort of Iowa versus Yamato potential matchup, etc., there are actually some fairly significant differences between the guns, as you might expect from the fact that one is 16-inch, one is 18-inch, but there you go. So looking more specifically at the shells, because those are the things that are going to end up doing the damage, the American shell is about 2,700 pounds, which is about 1.25 tons, all things considered. The Japanese shell is considerably heavier. It's almost 1.5 tons, 3,220 pounds, give or take, a couple of ounces. And that means that for a given velocity, the Japanese shell is going to have more kinetic energy, unsurprisingly. Now, one thing I always like to point out is the bursting charge. The American shells of World War II generally have slightly smaller bursting charges than average, and it's still a 16-inch shell, so it's still going to have less volume. And this does show quite considerably, in as much as the AP shells, in the Japanese shells, there's almost twice as much explosive. That is going to make a big difference, because if the shell gets inside the ship and it detonates, that's a lot more energy that's going to go into both demolishing whatever is nearby and also into propelling the fragments. And of course, being a much heavier shell, there's a lot more fragments with a lot more mass behind them to propel in the first place. Muzzle velocity is not all that much of a difference. There's 2,500 on the Iowa's guns and another 60 feet per second on the Yamato's guns. So that much isn't too much of a difference. Now, the other thing is when you get into the range of the guns. Now, both guns can elevate up to 45 degrees in their turret mounts, and that means they can fire out to ridiculous ranges that are far beyond any practical battle range. As much as it matters, the 18-inch gun can launch a shell about 3,000 yards further than the 16-inch gun. At that distance, I say it doesn't make too much odds. However, that does have reflections on what the shell's going to do closer in. Now, the angle of fall is about the same, but slight advantage to the Yamato class in that it comes in slightly shallower because of that slightly longer range at any given specific matched range, which means it has a slight advantage when it comes to penetrating belt armor, slight disadvantage when it comes to penetrating deck armor. Both advantages and disadvantages very, very small. Armor piercing capability is a little bit different, because if you run basic calculations and take certain sources, the armor penetration capability of the 18-inch gun is only marginally, near enough as makes no difference, almost the same as the armor penetration of the 16-inch gun, which could be accounted for in large part because, despite being larger and coming in with more kinetic energy, the Yamato's guns obviously had shells that were designed for underwater penetration as well, which does slightly compromise standard penetration. However, there are multiple sources for the penetration of the 18-inch guns, and they disagree quite a bit by a factor of several inches. So if you take the higher end calculations, the 18-inch gun actually has superior armor penetration by a relatively considerable margin compared to the Iowa class's 16-inch guns, albeit that the penetration numbers for both ships are so ridiculous that at any kind of practical battle range, there's precious little on Earth that's going to resist either way, apart from some turret faces. So it's kind of like, do you want mega overkill or ultra mega overkill in that respect? So yeah, if we take the general case in terms of practical battle range penetration, both guns, near as much as make no difference, are the same. They're coming in at roughly similar angles. They armor penetration, regardless of which figures you take, is still absurdly overkill for pretty much anything you can throw at it. The biggest difference that comes in is that sheer size and explosive power. So if Iowa fires a broadside at a target and Yamato fires a broadside at the same kind of target, the Yamato's guns will do more damage simply because they are bringing in a lot more weight of explosive, and the difference is such that even the different explosive mixes used in the two types of shells don't come close to compensating. And being a heavier shell, it's going to obviously consist of more material, which means more fragments, driven by more energy, so any individual hit from a Yamato's 18-inch guns is going to cause considerably more damage to a target than a hit from the 16-inch guns of the Iowa, albeit that you probably don't want to get hit by either of them, but you asked for if the difference was much more than marginal. Yeah, in that particular respect, there is a bit of a difference. Bill Cunningham asks, many folks have asked if you discuss Drydocks on the Drydock, so here it goes. Can you give a brief history of the development of what is now the modern Drydock? Well, to be perfectly honest, it's a huge subject and something I actually plan to cover in a Wednesday special video at some point, because it goes way back. I mean, we're talking before even Classical Age of Sail, possibly even going back all the way into ancient times for Drydocks. So, yeah, I can talk about it, but in nowhere near an acceptable level of detail compared to what I try to put into what would still be a relatively brief overview in a Wednesday special. So in very basic terms here, the Drydock, as a general thing, can be broken up into two specific types. You've got the static dock, which is often called a graving dock, and the floating Drydock, obviously the picture being of a static one. Now, they all follow the same idea, which is effectively a big box structure that is connected in some manner to the water, whether that's by gates or, in the case of a floating one, by the fact whether it's floating or not, at a certain level. You then have to let water in, then you open the gate, you put your ship inside the Drydock, you then have to send down divers or similar to put blocks in place to support the ship's hull, blocks and beams which connect to the Drydock's walls, and then once you're happy that the ship should be secure, you start pumping the water out, and as the water gets pumped out you can add more blocks and beams to further support the ship. Or in the case of a floating Drydock, you can just elevate it by blowing ballast tanks, etc. This eventually, hopefully, leads to the ship being suspended high and dry in your nice dry environment, and that then allows you to get to work on whatever kind of repairs or other work you might be doing to the ship in question. The newer the dock, the more boxy it's going to be as a rule. That's for two reasons. One, many modern ships are effectively boxes with slightly rounded fronts, but secondly, back in the old days when you had to excavate all of this stuff by hand, unnecessary excavation was by definition completely unnecessary. So if you knew approximately the shape and size of the biggest ships that you were likely to take into the dock, you would then dig it out to roughly those kind of dimensions plus a certain amount of width to allow for work to be carried out. And this had the advantage of, well, you weren't excavating anywhere near as much material, but also it made pumping in and out easier because there's less volume of water to move. And finally, it meant that if you got roughly matched the dimensions, your blocks and beams could be of not exactly the same dimensions all the time, but roughly similar dimensions. Whereas if you're trying to support a ship with a fairly three-dimensional flowing hull form in something that is a very boxy dry dock, you're going to have all sorts of weird and wacky shapes and sizes of blocks and beams in order to keep them all in place. The other advantage of the floating dry dock is, as compared to the static one, is that obviously you can take it with you to other places, which allows you to establish impromptu naval bases and repair stations for ships that might not be able to make it home or that are operating very far overseas, whereas the static dry dock can obviously be made considerably larger, much more easily and more cheaply. And then, of course, once your work is done and you think your ship's ready to go back into action, you get everyone out of it and slowly flood it. And once the dock is flooded, the ship hopefully remains buoyant, floats up. You can then send people in to get rid of the most offending blocks and beams and open the gates, and out the ship goes. And you can then drain the dock again and recover whatever else you need to recover. So that's a pocket-sized, very quick run-through of dry docks. But as I say, I suspect that's probably going to be one of the longer Wednesday specials when I eventually get round to it. Hope that was enough to whet your appetite. And so some channel admin. First of all, a shout out to the Evansville Dockyard and Museum. So for those of you who don't know, Evansville, which is in Indiana, was the largest inland producer of LSTs. Now, what's an LST, you might ask? It stands for Landing Ship Tank. So some of the bigger landing craft that were used, and indeed they have one, LST-325, which, amongst other things, was present for the D-Day landings and shuttled men, material and vehicles back and forth between England and France all through 1944. So if you want to see an actual D-Day survivor, LST-325 is there to be seen in Evansville, Indiana, and their website is lstmemorial.org. So I think that's probably worth a shout out. A small museum might be worth going to if you happen to be in the States, and I'm going to see if I can incorporate it into 2021's tour of US museum ships. The only other thing to mention at this stage is that hopefully channel video flow will not be interrupted during my stay in America. I will be pre-recording videos during this month, so it's a very busy month for me, in an attempt to try and make sure that you have all the 5-minute guides, Wednesday specials and dry docks that you need whilst I'm over in the States meeting a bunch of you and of course getting a bunch more footage for more videos. I know I've already done the complete set for the Iowa class, but since I'm going to be seeing 3 out of the 4, as well as a North Carolina class and a South Dakota class, and a bunch of other ships, of course, well, I'm sure you'll not object to a few more in-depth looks at certain aspects of these ships. With that in regard, I've got in contact with most of you by this point who've offered very kindly lifts and accommodation, so hopefully that will all be done. If you did and you haven't heard from me in the last week or two, please do drop me a line if you're still able to do so, as I need to be printing up an itinerary to remind myself of what's going on. I will publish the schedule yet again relatively soon for those of you who want to know, and the only well, assuming of course that we don't all get shut down Madagascar style because of all this nonsense floating around in the air at the moment. But other than that, so as not to spam you all on YouTube with updates via YouTube community, I've decided instead I will post the updates of where and when the fan meetups are going to be on the Discord server. I'll set up a, I'll put it in the announcements section, and also on my Twitter account, which is surprisingly enough Drachinifel. So yeah, if you are interested in meeting up, then either join the Discord server if you haven't already, or look up Drachinifel on Twitter, and when I know where I'm going, then I will post it on both of those platforms. The schedule, of course, will say which cities and which dates there are going to be meetups at, and they almost certainly will all be in the close proximity to the ships that I'm looking at on that particular day. So that'll give you a rough guide as to where I'm going to be, and obviously when I know where a good place to eat or meet is, I will let people know. So that'll be the exact locations and details will be notified close to the time. And yeah, hope to meet a bunch of you there. The only caveat I'll put on that is that obviously while I am trying to get footage, if you happen to also be on the ship that I'm touring, please feel free to come and say hi. Please feel free to try and follow along, as I do tend to set a bit of a breakneck speed when I'm doing film work. But if I'm in the middle of saying something to camera, please don't just come rushing up, because then I'll just be going, oh great, now I've got to redo that bit. I might even have various bits and pieces with me to give away. You never know. Depends how much I can fit in my bag. But anyway, enough rambling from Drac for today. And all that remains to be said is thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for watching. And I hope to see you all again in another video very soon.